Quiet endings often create the deepest damage. Not loud arguments, not dramatic exits, just one final emotional shift inside a person who spent too much time understanding everyone except themselves. Empaths rarely leave suddenly. They stay longer than they should. They forgive behavior that slowly destroys their peace. They keep explaining, keep hoping, keep believing people will finally change if enough love is given. That is why most people never notice the warning signs when an empath is emotionally reaching the end. The distance starts quietly. The emotional exhaustion builds silently, and one day the person who once tolerated everything becomes completely unreachable. Not because they stopped caring, but because caring started costing them their identity. Many people think empaths are naturally weak because they are emotional, patient, and deeply understanding. But psychology often shows the opposite. Highly empathetic people can endure emotional pain for extremely long periods before finally disconnecting. And when that disconnection happens, it is usually permanent. The dangerous part is that almost nobody sees it coming, because empaths often continue smiling, helping, listening, and supporting others while emotionally collapsing inside. They become experts at hiding disappointment, experts at suppressing resentment, experts at carrying emotional weight that was never theirs to hold. But every empath eventually reaches one final line, one realization that changes the way they see people forever. In this video, you will understand why empaths stay in painful relationships longer than most people, why emotional burnout slowly changes their personality, and what specific realization finally makes them walk away without looking back. You will also discover one of the lesser-known psychological truths about empathy that most people completely misunderstand. Empaths do not suddenly become cold. They become emotionally exhausted after repeated emotional betrayal, neglect, manipulation, or feeling unseen for too long. And once their mind connects love with emotional survival instead of emotional safety, everything changes. The version of them that kept giving endless chances slowly disappears. What replaces it is silence, emotional distance, and a level of detachment that shocks everyone around them. By the end of this video, you will fully understand the final sentence many empaths quietly say to themselves before they emotionally close the door forever. And the deeper truth behind that moment is far more painful than most people realize. Because the final breaking point for an empath is rarely anger. It is clarity. It is the moment they finally understand that no amount of love can heal people who are comfortable hurting them repeatedly. That realization changes everything. So stay with me until the end, because this is not just about empathy. This is about emotional survival, hidden exhaustion, and the silent psychological shift that turns one of the most understanding people into someone who finally chooses peace over attachment. Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy deep psychological insights and emotionally powerful videos like this, subscribe now and become part of this journey. Empaths often stay in situations that emotionally drain them far longer than most people understand. Not because they enjoy pain, not because they cannot see the damage, but because their mind naturally searches for emotional meaning behind human behavior. While most people react to actions alone, empaths react to emotions, patterns, wounds, silence, and hidden pain. They look deeper than the surface. That is why they often become trapped in relationships where they continue excusing behavior that slowly destroys them. An empath can recognize toxic patterns very early, but instead of immediately walking away, they start trying to emotionally understand why the person behaves that way. They notice childhood wounds, emotional insecurity, fear of abandonment, unhealed trauma. They notice sadness hidden behind anger. They notice loneliness hidden behind manipulation. And because they can emotionally feel what others carry inside, they begin justifying things they should never tolerate for so long. The problem is that empathy without boundaries slowly becomes self-destruction. Many empaths grow up believing love means patience, sacrifice, understanding, endurance. They unconsciously connect suffering with emotional loyalty. So when relationships become emotionally exhausting, they do not immediately think about leaving. They think about trying harder, communicating better, loving deeper, giving more chances. They become emotionally attached to potential instead of reality. They fall in love with who someone could become instead of accepting who they consistently are. And this creates one of the most painful cycles an empath can experience. Because every time they get hurt, they tell themselves the other person is struggling emotionally. Every time they feel ignored, they convince themselves the person is stressed. Every time respect disappears, they search for emotional explanations instead of protecting themselves. They keep hoping consistency will eventually appear if enough understanding is given. That is why empaths often remain emotionally available even after repeated disappointment. Their compassion keeps overriding their self-protection. Their emotional intelligence becomes the very thing that traps them, and slowly, without realizing it, they begin abandoning themselves while trying to save someone else emotionally. One of the deepest psychological traits many empaths carry is the fear of becoming the reason someone else suffers. Even when they are emotionally exhausted, they hesitate to leave because they know their absence could hurt the other person. They worry about guilt, regret, emotional damage. They worry about abandoning someone who may already feel broken inside. So instead of prioritizing their own mental peace, they continue tolerating emotional imbalance. They absorb pain quietly. They suppress resentment quietly. They convince themselves they can survive just a little longer. But emotional endurance is not infinite. No human being can continuously pour emotional energy into people who give inconsistency back without eventually collapsing internally. At first, the exhaustion is subtle, small, almost invisible. The empath still answers messages with warmth, still listens carefully, still comforts others, still shows emotional patience. But internally, something begins changing. Emotional giving slowly starts feeling heavier. Conversations begin feeling draining instead of fulfilling. The empath starts noticing that their kindness is no longer appreciated. It becomes expected. People begin depending on their emotional support while ignoring the empath's own emotional needs completely. The empath becomes the safe place for everyone else, while secretly having nowhere emotionally safe to go themselves. This is where emotional burnout quietly begins. Not through dramatic betrayal at first, but through repeated emotional imbalance over time. Small disappointments begin stacking silently inside them, promises broken repeatedly, effort not reciprocated, emotional neglect disguised as normal behavior, being understood less and less while constantly understanding everyone else. And because empaths are naturally skilled at emotional regulation, they often hide this exhaustion extremely well. Most people around them never notice the internal collapse happening beneath the calm surface. That is what makes empath burnout so dangerous. They rarely explode immediately. They disconnect internally first, quietly, slowly. Their energy changes before their behavior changes. Their emotional reactions become softer. Their excitement becomes weaker. Their emotional availability begins shrinking. They stop over-explaining certain feelings because they no longer believe they are being heard deeply anyway. They begin emotionally withdrawing from conversations that once mattered to them, but outwardly they still appear calm, functional, understanding, patient, and because they are not screaming or creating chaos, nobody realizes how emotionally close they are to shutting down completely. Many people mistake an empath's silence for peace when it is actually emotional fatigue. They mistake emotional patience for endless tolerance. They assume the empath will always continue forgiving because that is what they have always done before. But internally, the empath is reaching a dangerous point, a point where emotional pain slowly transforms into emotional numbness. And numbness is often the final stage before detachment. The hardest part is that empaths usually continue trying even while emotionally exhausted. They continue giving explanations, continue seeking healthy communication, continue hoping the relationship can still heal. But eventually a moment arrives that changes everything permanently. Sometimes it happens during an argument, sometimes during silence, sometimes during another broken promise, sometimes during a moment where the empath realizes they are comforting the very person hurting them. It is rarely one massive event alone. It is usually the weight of accumulated disappointment finally becoming impossible to ignore. One final moment suddenly forces emotional clarity. The illusion breaks. The empath finally sees the relationship without emotional fantasy protecting it anymore. And for the first time, they stop focusing on who the person could become and start seeing who they consistently choose to be. That realization is devastating because empaths do not emotionally invest lightly. They invest deeply, fully, sincerely. So when clarity finally arrives, it feels like grieving both the relationship and the future they emotionally imagined. The empath begins replaying everything in their mind differently now. They realize how much overgiving happened, how much emotional labor they carried alone. how much over-explaining they did trying to gain basic understanding. They realized they kept trying to communicate with someone who only listened when it benefited them emotionally. They recognized how often they forgave behavior that would have made anyone else leave much earlier. And eventually, one painful realization becomes impossible to escape. If someone truly cared, basic emotional respect would never require begging. Genuine care does not consistently leave someone emotionally starving while expecting unlimited patience in return. Real love does not repeatedly drain one person while the other remains emotionally comfortable. This realization changes the empath deeply because the pain suddenly becomes clarity instead of confusion. Before this moment, they kept questioning themselves. Maybe they were too sensitive. Maybe they expected too much. Maybe they just needed more patience. But clarity removes self-doubt. The empath finally understands they were not asking for too much. They were asking the wrong person repeatedly. And once that emotional truth settles inside them, something powerful happens. They stop trying to fix everything. The emotional chasing slows down. The desperate need to explain every feeling disappears. The constant emotional monitoring fades. This is the moment many people misunderstand completely. They call the empath cold, distant, different. But what they are actually witnessing is emotional shutdown after prolonged emotional exhaustion. The empath is not becoming heartless. They are becoming emotionally protective. There is a major psychological difference between someone who stops caring and someone who becomes tired of bleeding emotionally for people who never valued their wounds. Most people only notice the empath's final withdrawal because they ignored all the quiet suffering that came before it. By the time the empath emotionally detaches, they have usually spent months or years trying to save the relationship internally. That is why the final shift often appears sudden only to outsiders. Inside the empath, the grieving process started long ago, and eventually one sentence forms silently inside their mind. A sentence so emotionally powerful that it changes everything permanently. I cannot keep destroying myself trying to save someone who does not care about losing me. That sentence becomes the emotional line separating survival from self-abandonment. Because for the first time, the empath stops focusing entirely on the other person's pain and finally acknowledges their own. They finally recognize how much emotional damage constant overgiving has caused. They realize they have been carrying relationships almost entirely through emotional labor while receiving inconsistency in return. This moment becomes life-changing because it ends several destructive patterns at once. It ends emotional chasing. The empath stops trying to force emotional understanding into people committed to misunderstanding them. It ends over-explaining. They no longer waste energy repeatedly explaining pain to someone who only listens temporarily. It ends self-abandonment. The empath finally understands that sacrificing their mental health to preserve a connection is not love, it is slow emotional self-destruction. And most importantly, it replaces guilt with self-protection. For a long time, empaths feel guilty anytime they prioritize themselves. They feel selfish for setting boundaries. They feel cruel for emotionally distancing themselves. But eventually, survival instincts become stronger than guilt. They finally realize boundaries are not punishment. Distance is not hatred. Walking away is not betrayal when staying is emotionally destroying them. One of the lesser understood truths about empaths is that they often leave emotionally long before they leave physically. By the time they officially walk away, their internal connection has already weakened dramatically. The crying, overthinking, emotional begging, and exhausting attempts to repair everything usually happened privately long before anyone noticed. That is why the final departure often feels calm instead of dramatic. The empath no longer has energy left for emotional chaos. Their silence becomes heavy, controlled, detached. And this silence shocks people deeply because they became used to the empath always caring more, always returning, always forgiving. People mistake an empath's patience for weakness because they misunderstand emotional endurance. They assume that because the empath tolerated so much before, they will tolerate everything forever. They become emotionally comfortable. They stop taking the empath's pain seriously because previous forgiveness created the illusion of endless chances. But emotional tolerance has limits. Even the most understanding person eventually reaches exhaustion when emotional reciprocity never arrives. That is why many people become shocked after the empath finally leaves. Suddenly, the person who once over-explained every feeling says almost nothing. The person who fought to save the relationship stops fighting completely. The emotional warmth disappears quietly, and people panic because they can feel the difference immediately. They are no longer interacting with someone trying desperately to preserve connection. They are interacting with someone who emotionally accepted the loss already. The most dangerous silence comes from someone who is finally done explaining their pain. Because once a person reaches that stage, emotional detachment becomes extremely difficult to reverse. The empath no longer believes words alone. They no longer trust temporary effort created by fear of abandonment. They become emotionally observant instead of emotionally hopeful. And this shift changes how they interact with everyone around them. Their energy becomes calmer but more distant. They stop forcing emotional access. They stop trying to convince people to care. They stop shrinking themselves emotionally to make others comfortable. Some people interpret this as bitterness, but it is often emotional recovery beginning. For years, the empath ignored their own emotional needs while prioritizing everyone else's feelings. Now they are finally learning what self-preservation feels like. And unfortunately, many people only value an empath fully after losing emotional access to them. While the empath was constantly available, their emotional labor was taken for granted. Their listening, their patience, their understanding, their forgiveness, all of it became normalized instead of appreciated. But once that energy disappears, the emotional emptiness becomes impossible to ignore. Suddenly, people recognize how much emotional safety the empath provided, but by then the empath has often reached a level of exhaustion where returning no longer feels emotionally safe. This is one of the saddest realities empaths experience. They usually gave countless chances before walking away. Endless internal battles happened before the final decision. They stayed through confusion, disappointment, emotional inconsistency, and loneliness, hoping things would improve. But eventually they understand a painful truth. Love cannot survive where emotional reciprocity does not exist. No matter how deeply one person cares, relationships cannot remain healthy when only one side consistently sacrifices themselves emotionally. And this realization changes the empath permanently. Not because they stop loving deeply, but because they finally understand the cost of loving without boundaries. Empaths do not walk away because they suddenly stop caring. In fact, many still care deeply even while leaving. That is what makes the process so emotionally painful for them. They leave because caring started destroying their peace, identity, mental stability, and emotional health. Staying became more painful than separation itself. The relationship stopped feeling emotionally safe and started feeling emotionally consuming. Walking away becomes an act of emotional survival rather than revenge. Distance becomes peace. Silence becomes healing. Solitude becomes safer than inconsistent emotional attachment. And slowly the empath begins rebuilding parts of themselves they abandoned while trying to save everyone else. They rediscover emotional calm without constant anxiety. They rediscover rest without emotional hypervigilance. They rediscover what it feels like to exist without carrying another person's emotional chaos every day. The healing process is not immediate because empaths often carry deep emotional memory. They replay conversations, reanalyze situations, question whether they could have done more. But eventually another realization settles inside them quietly. They already did more than enough. They gave more patience than most people would, more understanding, more emotional labor, more forgiveness, more chances, and at some point continuing to give beyond that only becomes self-neglect. This is the lesson many empaths learn too late. Love without reciprocity slowly becomes self-destruction. Because relationships are not supposed to survive through one person constantly sacrificing themselves emotionally, while the other remains emotionally unavailable, inconsistent, dismissive, or careless. Healthy love requires mutual emotional responsibility, mutual effort, mutual respect. Without those things, empathy becomes exploitation. And once an empath fully understands that truth emotionally, not just intellectually, their entire perspective changes. They stop romanticizing emotional suffering. They stop glorifying endless patience. They stop believing love means tolerating repeated emotional wounds indefinitely. Instead, they begin valuing peace, stability, emotional safety, genuine reciprocity. They become more selective with emotional access because they finally understand how dangerous limitless empathy can become in the wrong environments. The strongest empaths are not the ones who endlessly sacrifice themselves for everyone around them. The strongest empaths are the ones who finally learn that protecting their own emotional well-being matters too. And once they truly learn that lesson, they rarely return to the version of themselves that tolerated emotional neglect just to avoid losing people. So no, empaths do not suddenly become cold. The truth is much deeper than that. They simply reach a point where carrying everyone else emotionally becomes heavier than losing the connection itself. For a long time, they keep choosing understanding over boundaries, patience over peace, silence over confrontation. They keep hoping their love, loyalty, and emotional presence will finally be enough to create change, but eventually reality becomes impossible to ignore. The constant emotional exhaustion, the feeling of being unseen, the endless cycle of giving without receiving the same care back slowly changes something inside them. And one day, the empath who once fought so hard to keep everyone together finally becomes tired of abandoning themselves just to keep others comfortable. That is the moment everything changes, not because they stopped caring, but because they finally realized caring should never require self-destruction. Some of the quietest people carry the deepest emotional wounds, and empaths often spend years hiding pain behind kindness that nobody truly notices. They continue loving while secretly falling apart inside. They continue forgiving while emotionally bleeding in silence. And when they finally walk away, most people only notice the absence of their warmth. They never fully understand the exhaustion that created the distance in the first place. The final line that ends everything for an empath is rarely spoken out loud. It happens silently inside them. It is the moment they finally understand that protecting their peace is not selfish. Choosing themselves is not cruelty. Walking away from emotional damage is not weakness, it is survival. And once an empath reaches that level of clarity, they rarely return to the version of themselves that accepted less than they deserved. If this video felt personal, you are not alone. So many people silently carry emotional exhaustion while pretending everything is fine on the outside. And sometimes hearing these truths helps people finally understand what they have been feeling for years. If you connected with this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deep psychological insights and emotionally powerful content like this. Like this video because it truly helps the channel grow, and share it with someone who keeps giving endless chances while slowly losing themselves in the process. Sometimes one video can explain emotions people have never been able to put into words,